Okay, today we are going to tackle a philosopher and intellect who I think is by far the most intimidating and difficult to read writer for me of all time, and that is Hegel. True story. I one time was attempting to read Hegel on a bus, and an older woman came up to me and said, "Are you reading Hegel?" And I said, "Yes." And she just said, "I'm so sorry." And that captures how a lot of people feel when they are attempting to engage with his ideas. Luckily, we are not going to be parsing the details of Hegel's philosophy today. That is not our task. We're just going to briefly look at ways he influenced modern theology. So Hegel agreed with Kant on a number of issues, but probably more important are his disagreements. To understand the nature of their disagreement, it's good to know the terms philosophy of religion and philosophical theology. So philosophy of religion is kind of the work Kant was doing, where he's saying, we can look at religions and look at the way that these ideas about autonomy enable moral action. But he's offering up philosophical analysis on religion. Philosophical theology, on the other hand, is an attempt to use the tools of philosophy to assert or affirm theological truths, which, if you remember, Kant was not interested in doing. He didn't want to really try to prove that Christianity was real. He just wanted to say it's morally advantageous for people to think Christianity is real. Hegel is a little bit more optimistic on philosophical theology, so that later one. His branch of metaphysics came to be known as Hegelian idealism, and so it's the idea that reality, what we all experience, is rational, it is a unified whole, and that it is moving in a good direction over time. So one easy way to kind of just latch on to remembering Hegel's influence is H for Hegel, H for history. I know that's silly, but it helps me, so maybe it will help you. It was one of the first philosophies to really give priority to history, not just as past events we can learn from, but actually as the act of history being the unfolding of what he calls the spirit, but it really just means like perfect reason coming into being through history. So for Hegel, nothing is real until it is actualized in history, and that's going to be important for understanding his attitude towards Christianity. So Christianity has historically been very interested in this idea of reconciliation between the God of Israel and his creation. Hegel likes Christianity a lot because he's also very interested in the idea of reconciliation. However, for Hegel, it's not so much about sinners being reconciled to a perfect God. Reconciliation needs to happen between the infinite and the finite. Those are important. And he equates man's fallenness or man's sinfulness with man being finite. Not that finiteness is necessarily evil, but the stage in which man sees himself as finite and separate from the infinite, that stage in history is an evil stage that needs to be resolved. And so if Hegel is so concerned with reconciling the finite to the infinite, what does that start to sound like? It sounds a lot like the incarnation, obviously core Christian doctrine. So this idea of God, infinite, becoming reconciled to man, finiteness in the person of Christ, is a very important doctrine to Hegel. And likewise, the resurrection, he views that as being the eradication of finiteness, of reality coming into its own through this story. So yeah, the incarnation is hugely important to Hegel, and that becomes hugely important to modern theology because it really reverses this trend where Kant and others like him said that the Christ was, a good moral example to follow, or just a good teacher, but not understanding his identity of Christ as being important. And so for Hegel, there's no such thing as truth until it comes into being in history. And he sees the truth of reason coming into its own in history as being best represented in Christ coming into the incarnation, dying and resurrecting. But if you're thinking that all sounds like pretty orthodox and uncontroversial, Hegel definitely parts ways with Christian beliefs on some pretty significant points. For Hegel, Jesus, first of all, didn't make reconciliation possible. The infinite and the finite were always going to be reconciled. Jesus is merely the mechanism by which we all realize that we were never really distinct from God. And so that's going to cause a lot of pushback from later thinkers such as Barth or Kierkegaard, because for them, it's so important that there be this distinction between God and man, that God be wholly other. And for Hegel, that distinction just isn't a reality. So let's quickly talk about his impact. Hegel's dedication to the story of Christianity as being true brought philosophical theology back into the conversation from the shadowy corner where Kant had banished it. In terms of his legacy, it really split kind of into like the right and the left. On the left, his theories were taken up by the likes of Karl Marx, although Marx famously said that we need to turn Hegel on his head. So where Hegel saw the absolute or the spirit or pure reason as unfolding and coming into reality through history, Marx saw the unfolding of history as being driven by economic forces, but was still hugely influenced by Hegel. And then on the other side, there were huge influences from Hegel into British idealism, which had a lot to do with the forming of political philosophy, ethics, morality, things like that. So Hegel's influence is still felt today. I'm reading a book right now in which the author's making the argument that the spirit of God is less of a person and more the spirit becomes real as he acts among us. And that's kind of a Hegelian idea. So still very much felt today. Again, this was like the briefest of brief introductions, but if you take nothing away, Hegel, history, the absolute becoming real and actualized in history, and the incarnation and resurrection as being the best metaphors we have for understanding what he saw as being truly true, but also varying clearly from Orthodox Christianity in a lot of ways.